with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, September 12th, 2022. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Jeremy Gilbert, professor of cultural and political theory at the University of East London, and Alex Williams, lecturer in digital media and society at the University of East Anglia. Anglia. Is that what it is? Anglia. Sorry.
Anglia, yep.
Anglia. Co-authors of Hegemony Now, How Big Tech and Wall Street Won the World, Parens, and How We Win It Back. Also on the program today, Ukraine's offensive seems to have been and being wildly successful. Could portend a Ukrainian victory. House January 6th committee reconvenes amid reports Trump thought it absurd that he'd just leave the White House. Why would I do that? Tomorrow is primary day in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Delaware. AP poll, majority of Americans unhappy with the healthcare system. New report, child poverty dropped dramatically from 93 to 2019 as federal spending on low-income children doubled. Imagine that. Seattle teachers, day 4 of a strike. And in Minnesota, 15,000 nurses also head to the picket lines in what is the largest private nurses strike, I think, ever. Slated to last 3 days. Lastly, federal EPA investigators are now in Jackson, Mississippi to figure out what's going on with that water crisis. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. Obviously, I also neglected to say that there's a new king in England. There's a new king of England, Charles.
I saw a thread about Zoom-based naturalization process in Canada, and they had to pause it in the middle of it to figure out what they are going to do, because you have to swear fealty to Queen Elizabeth, and then she died, so they had to figure out what they're going to do, and it's now to King Charles III.
There you go. And they got to redo the money, and they got to do all that stuff.
Oh, man, I forgot about that.
Somebody on Twitter got angry at me because I was so cavalier and glib about the passing of the Queen. I am sure there are people who listen to this program who still feel some type of fealty to the monarch. And if I offended you in any way, I mean, I'm not looking to offend you, but I really don't feel that badly.
It's 2022.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I want you to accept that as a somewhat of apology. I mean, I can't really go full bore without, being...
It's more an acknowledgement of their existence.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm sure there were people who are, glib about the passing of Ronald Reagan. And cool. I was also one of those people.
Nice.
I'm just trying to I guess the fact that there would be someone who would be really offended by my not taking your queen that seriously, I think is part of the problem with the whole monarchy. And yes, there was examples of, I mean, a lot of people cite the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. I think it was in the most of the 50s, late 50s, where, I don't know, 12,000 people, maybe 8 to 12,000. I don't recall all the details were killed. And I think she had just visited after she had just been named queen, and they put that down, but there you go. But yes, let me put it this way. I was a lot happier that Scalia passed away than I was the queen. I just didn't care about the queen, but I was happy about Scalia. Only because of the implications for the world. I think, I'm sure Charles will slide in there as king and do all the good things that the queen did. And maybe they don't do bad things anymore, but it is a sort of a reminder of like an era that maybe, I don't know, people shouldn't necessarily be so celebratory of.
I think the corgi should be head of state now.
Yeah, that's also a side thing. Like, did she have like a bunch of dogs? I'm not sure.
She had a whole bunch of corgis.
Yeah. All right. I don't know anything about that.
There's a whole family tree of them stemming back like 60 years of like all of her.
Which is not that
corgis.
long, actually.
Yeah. Again, there are people who have too much money, and we should not allow them to have that much money, whether they're, near demigods, right? Like you're the chosen one, right? I mean, God has said.
What if you're really graceful and maternal, though? Should you get to have that much money?
I think if you were that graceful and that maternal, you'd say, like, I shouldn't have this much money.
Yeah, maybe.
That's sort of my feeling. That's almost like one of my top definitions of being graceful and maternal. Also graceful and paternal. And also graceful and what's the word for sibling or just
Fraternal.
Fraternal?
That's the boy one, at least.
Yeah. I don't think anybody should have that kind of money or power. So that's where I'm at. Folks, with that said, let's play this clip. Do we have time for this clip now? I think we do. I somehow got off on a tangent there. I want to talk about some of those other polls and stuff like that. We'll have time in the fun half for that. Now I got the IMs are just like exploding with people who are like rooting for different people to die. I mean, there we go. We're really nurturing a
healthy
nice
discourse.
Community. Yep, there you go. There's a lot of different ways to interpret the numbers that we're seeing. There's polling in the Wall Street Journal today that suggests that independents are starting to favor Biden and the Democrats. There is polling to suggest that, and the reasons would be a combination of the January 6th hearing, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and the fact that the Democrats, and again, I think for folks who listen to this show, feel like it has been insufficient. But from the perspective of, independent, so-called independent voters who tend to be low information and really just want to see some type of action. The storyline for Biden has been he's been racking up wins, which, that is the way that a lot of people make their decisions on politics, sadly to say.
Winning all over the place.
But those wins, I think for folks around here, it would be just slightly better than a tie, but a slightly better than a tie is better than slightly worse than a tie. And the forgiving $10,000 worth of college debt has been, by all accounts, very successful politically. The getting the benefits in that package associated with Medicare and Medicaid and drug prices and the sort of Build Back a Bit bill, essentially, has been positive, at least insofar as that they've gotten credit for doing something. But there are other places I've been reading where they say, the places where it appears that Democrats have made gains is also where we have found some failure of the polls to capture what the real numbers were in 2020, which is why people overestimated how well Democrats would do. So I don't know. You pick it. But one of the things that's clear is that the Supreme Court is increasingly becoming an issue for Democratic voters. And if I had my druthers, this would have happened 18 years ago. Well, 25 years ago, frankly, 30 years ago. But the courts are incredibly important, and we see that increasingly every day. And we're going to see it even more so in the coming weeks, months, and years. Here's Al Franken making a very strong case that the legitimacy of the Supreme Court has sunk. And this is going to be important because as this stuff seeps into the mainstream or the conventional wisdom or the Washington Beltway elite, as it were, it's going to open up the door to things like filibuster reform and reforming the Supreme Court. Here is Al Franken debating with CNN's Alice Stewart, but she's CNN is really very quickly turning into essentially a Republican, an all Republican.
Yeah, Fox News.
Yeah, sort of the never Trumper Republican type of thing. I mean, to outdo MSNBC. It's probably a good thing because maybe MSNBC will have some challenges to their entire contributor staff. But
she also worked for two of Mike Huckabee's presidential campaigns.
Oof. Okay. Yep. Only the best, though. Here's Franken.
Said the legitimacy of the court was undermined when they wouldn't take up Merrick Garland. And you'll remember that McConnell said it was because it was during election year. And you remember Lindsey Graham pledging that if a vacancy came open during an election year in 20, that he wouldn't vote for, they wouldn't take up a nominee. They've stolen 2 seats. The one that Merrick Garland wasn't given a hearing for, and the one that Coney Barrett was, where she was seated a week before the election. That destroyed the legitimacy of the court.
Alice, what do you think? Did Chief Justice Roberts he sort of ignored some of what Al is talking about there, and that there is a tremendous amount of controversy as to how this court got tilted in the direction of the far right.
Just to throw a little accuracy in some of what Al said there. Look, the Merrick Garland was held up because we had a divided government. We had a Democrat in the White House, and we had Republicans in control of.
That's not what McConnell said.
But that's the way historically this has been. When you're in close to an election year and you have divided government.
That's not the way it's been historically done.
Yes, and when you have divided government, there typically is inclination to.
Tell me when this happened before.
Merrick Garland is certainly one. When there's a divided government,
no, before Merrick Garland,
they're not moving forward.
Tell me when this happened before.
Al, I'm telling you, this is what the Mitch.
Tell me when it happened before.
I can't.
You said this is what happened historically. Tell me when it happened before.
Look, this is the way that the Republicans
went.
Like, I can't give you an exact example of when this happened
in
the past.
You know why you can't? Because it hadn't happened before.
I mean, this is the thing, is that like one of the fundamental differences, like with right-wing and left-wing pundits. Now Franken also, I have to say, is I have always found him to be incredibly knowledgeable about stuff. I haven't always necessarily agreed with all of his politics, but he's extremely intelligent and knowledgeable. I said on day one that he became a senator, he was in the top 5%, probably, maybe 8%. It's easy to do the math there. But maybe they're just in the top, 5-8% of senators who knew what they were talking about anything. And he also was in the Senate at that time, if I remember correctly, or pretty close. And they just go out with their talking points and never even do the slightest bit of like, should I read? Like, I'm just doing the top line. I don't need the second paragraph. And because in this instance, there wasn't. I mean, that is really the point, is that like the credibility of the court, and John Roberts can get out there and whine about it all he wants. Credibility as a court is really in shambles. And it's going to be interesting to see if they ever release that report. Gorsuch claims they will about the leak. But I mean, we'll see. But yes, all of this is important, because the more that people understand, and really this should have happened after the 2000 election, but didn't because of 9/11. Understanding what the court is and how the right has begun to use this court is, I think, crucial to understanding where we are and where we're going to be in the next couple of years of our politics. And by couple, I mean like 2 decades, unless something is done. Speaking of 9/11, I'll have a couple words on it maybe at the end of the show today. Don't have too much to say, but I did see an interesting interview that I think may have been even a year old with Paul Jay, who is the guy who found the Real News network. I don't think he's there anymore at that place, but he had a good dissertation of all the stuff that like sort of summarized the first couple of years that I was on radio, frankly, we talk about, and it's worth reminding everybody. But first, a couple words from our sponsors. Also, I should also say, somebody on Twitter wanted me to amplify this a little bit. There is a rally for Julian Assange in D.C. on Saturday, October 8th, as part of a day of global action. I have some mixed feelings about Assange, but I think it is important. And as far as I understand it, the charges that the U.S. government, and I haven't dug into this too much, to be honest, do not have to do with the leak that Bradley Manning, or I should say that Chelsea Manning served prison time for. But at that time, WikiLeaks was really demonized. And in fact, it turned out to be like, well, almost every story that we heard about. I mean, the newsworthy value of that information was evident if you in any way engaged in the news. They weren't always credited to those leaks, but literally at least 3 or 4 stories a day globally came out for a couple of years from those leaks. And I think just for the sake of protecting the media, and particularly, around 9/11, you remember the way the media was both chilled and bent to the will of the Bush administration. So as a general principle, a good thing to do, even in close calls. 12-3, October 8th, at the DOJ in Washington, D.C. On October 8th. Meanwhile, speaking of things like spying and today we're going to be talking about big tech and Wall Street won the world. One of the ways the big tech has gained such hegemony is because they feed on your data and information. And even when they pretend that they're going to protect your privacy, no. If you want to protect yourself against big tech's prying eyes, use ExpressVPN. They're scraping your data. They're putting together composites of who you are, where you go, feeding you stuff that, particularly in general, very unhealthy for society. And to the extent that it's going to be problematic for you as an individual, you never know. So that's why I use ExpressVPN. When you use the ExpressVPN on your app on your phone or your computer or your iPad or your tablet, you're hiding your unique IP address. ExpressVPN encrypts and reroutes 100% of your online activity. So your internet provider, your Wi-Fi administrator, that guy who's stealing your Wi-Fi information, whoever it is, hackers, they can't see it. And this is the thing that I love about ExpressVPN. It takes one click, and then you protect all your devices. And one ExpressVPN subscription covers up to 5 devices at the same time. So for me, my phone, my computer, and then my kids. That's the way I do it. ExpressVPN is rated number 1 by CNET. It's rated number 1 by Wired, TechRadar, and countless others. Look, it's super easy to use. You get the app, literally one click, then you're done. Well, you choose where you want your router to your server to be. I like to do LA. I don't know why. I just like to do that. Get VPN that I trust to protect my online privacy when big bad tech is at the door. Visit expressvpn.com/majority. You can get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/majority. expressvpn.com/majority to learn more. Also, I've said this many, many times. Best time to hire somebody or look for somebody that you need help with at work is when you don't need to hire somebody. And that is particularly now as well. A lot of stories out there as to why hiring is so challenging now. A couple of things. We'll talk about that maybe tomorrow, actually. There's some research I've been reading about both long COVID and about changes to the two-earner dynamic because of childcare, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line, hiring is challenging. And it's challenging in any environment because it's just difficult to do when you have a small business like we do here. But there's one place you can go where hiring is simple, fast, and smart. It's a place where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. And that place, well, you know it. I've been talking about them for years. ZipRecruiter.com/majority. We've used ZipRecruiter here. And the beauty of it is ZipRecruiter does the work for you. ZipRecruiter uses its powerful technology to find and match the right candidates up with your job. You can then easily review these recommended candidates, invite your top choices to apply. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. It is no wonder that ZipRecruiter is the #1 rated hiring site based on G2 satisfaction ratings as of January 1st, 2022. And their interface is also super easy. That is the part that I really appreciated. It made it very easy. First off, I found great candidates when I was hiring back in the day. And the interface made it really easy for me to organize, rate, prioritize who I want to meet with, click off that I've met with them, notes as to what my thoughts were, et cetera, et cetera. And crucial for someone like me who doesn't, not so adept with executive function and administrative stuff. Right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. My listeners, go to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. That's ZipRecruiter.com/majority. MAJORITY. ZipRecruiter.com/majority. ZipRecruiter, it's the smartest way to hire. And lastly, folks, you got till the end of today. The end of day today. So get on it. SunsetLakeSabadell.com. They have a new product. The release of Good Vibe Gummies they're announcing. It's a full spectrum gummy crafted with a blend of CBD and hemp-derived THC. Each Good Vibe gummy is infused with 3 milligrams of THC and 30 milligrams of CBD. Good Vibe gummies are perfect for taking the edge off after a long day, or relaxing with friends and family, or perhaps taking the edge off a day that you anticipate is going to be a long day. Start of school, provide some of that in my household. And they are spreading the good vibes at Sunset Lake Sabadell by offering 30% off of all gummies, including their famous sleep gummies with melatonin. It's like a boysenberry or black. Is that what it is? It's delicious. I actually think those things are delicious. And it helps me remind me to take some. Starting last week, all the Sabadell gummies are 30% off with the coupon code GOODVIBE. That's one word, Good Vibe. Good Vibe gummies are made from full spectrum Sabadell oil from Sunset Lake's hemp farm and can be delivered anywhere in the U.S. I've been using these things now, I guess, for a little bit less than a week. I'll mix in the melatonin occasionally when I'm going to sleep, but I hit these hard this week. I had a bit of a week.
The mango ones?
The mango ones.
Yeah. Maybe that's the only one there is, but that's the one.
No, that's the Good Vibe one. But at night I've been using the melatonin, and I'll pop one of those as well. They're delicious. Folks still can enjoy the sour bear gummies too. Check it out. All of these last day for the sale, 30% off. And just to remind you, Sunset Lake Sabadell, majority employee owned company. They have a $20 minimum wage. They have donated nearly $30,000 over the past, I don't know what it is, 2 or 3 years that we've been working with them anyways. They have done it for the Innocence Project. They did it for soup kitchens. They did it for strike funds, nurses in Worcester. They do it for refugee resettlement, Give Directly, a whole bunch of stuff. The real movement partners. Again, today is the last day. All Sabadell gummies are 30% off with the coupon code Good Vibe. Visit sunsetlakesabadell.com and try these new products. Great company. All right. Want to welcome to the program. Do we need to take a quick break? Okay, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with Jeremy Gilbert and Alex Williams. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. We got to do a little bit of finessing with the camera stuff. Wait, I'm trying to do that too, guys. All right, there we go. And I'll pull out a little bit. Welcome back to the show. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland on holiday. One more day for that. Joining me now, Jeremy Gilbert, professor of cultural and political theory at the University of East London, and Alex Williams, lecturer in digital media and society at the University of East Anglia. They are co-authors of their recent Hegemony Now, How Big Tech and Wall Street Won the World and How We Win It Back, in parentheses. Jeremy and Alex, welcome to the program. Just want to say, for everyone to understand out there, those are not ukuleles behind you. Those are, in fact, guitars, but wide-angle lenses. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having us. I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, let's just start with this. Let's little remedial to just start the first question with the title of the book, but hegemony. In the context of what you're talking about, what does that mean?
Well, so hegemony is a term which comes from the writings of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. I mean, it's a word that has some other meanings in other contexts, but in the tradition of radical political theory, really it translates an Italian word, which is more usually translated as leadership. So basically that's what it means. And what it refers to is the ability of relatively small groups in a society to exercise a kind of leadership over the rest of the society. So the way we like to explain this is to say that hegemony is basically the capacity to determine the general direction of travel for a society or a group or indeed for the whole planet. So that's basically what we mean by it.
All right. And fair enough. And so, Alex, as you guys write, this, it's so much of like what we talk about on this program, much of this, hegemony begins, or at least those who are in a position of having hegemony over the direction of society starts in the 70s, as we enter into an era of financialization, and also almost simultaneously the development of new technology that both enhances the ability for financialization and then also becomes sort of platforms in and of itself. Give us a little bit of that history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really kind of nice way of introducing it. I mean, a lot of the time, neither of those things is really mentioned when you think about the 1970s. Certainly a lot of academics and kind of leftist commentators would rather talk about neoliberalism, right? So they'd be talking about maybe about Thatcher Reagan, maybe about the Mont Pelerin Society and Friedrich von Hayek and Friedman and all of that. And certainly all of that is very important. The slightly less remarked upon component of their ability to implement neoliberalism, you know, first of all in the kind of Anglophone world and then later on across Europe and then the rest of the world. A lot of what enabled them to do that was exactly the fact that, you know, financialization could occur, that, you know, technology allowed things like, you know, disaggregation of production systems. So, you know, you could crush your working class within America or the UK because much of your production was going to be happening in Southeast Asia. And all of this involves the emergence of kind of computerization, later the internet, and the liberalization of finance. And all of these things kind of happen together and are kind of, they're all involved in this kind of process. And very much today when we look around, you know, who is it who's managed to get what they want? You know, which groups in society have managed to kind of achieve their aims best of all? And it wasn't the kind of Thatcher Reagan conservatives, because, you know, they'd look at sort of much of modern society and be pretty aghast at the kind of the lack of social conservatism. And instead, the people who've really got what they want are the people who work in, you know, big finance and big tech. They've achieved most of what they want if you look around us.
I want to examine that last point a little bit too, because I think, you know, it feels to me like part of Thatcher and Reagan's agenda was also this sort of like neoliberal economics. I think they also, at least in Reagan's case, was very conscious of, like, you know, who was going to be the wind under his sails, as it were. But I mean, just for the sake of folks who don't fully understand the concept of financialization, give us a sense of like what the difference is between what financialization means in terms of like when we're talking about, we've moved from something where, you know, we're just talking about companies making money via producing things and putting it out there, providing services to what when we talk about financialization?
Yeah, you're talking about a shift from an economy in which indeed, as you say, in which the bottom line of companies is mainly a function of how well they produce stuff and get it out to people who want to buy it, to one in which that's relatively secondary. And the thing that really determines the profitability and the share price of companies is just their ability to engage in these kind of speculations on the rising prices of assets, the rising prices of shares, and above all on debt, actually. I mean, the whole economy, I mean, the big shift towards a kind of financialized economy from the 70s onwards is a shift to an economy that is based on debt, and a shift towards an economy where how rich you are, either as a corporation, depends on how much debt you can sell to people and to other, including other corporations, but also people's standard of living as consumers increasingly depends on access to cheap credit, on access to, rather than their actual real wages. Comparing real wages at different historical moments is notoriously quite difficult, but on some measures, real wages, and certainly wages as a share of the overall economy, are stagnating really from the early 70s onwards, pretty much indefinitely, with some little blips subsequently. And so people are only able to enjoy this increase in their standard of living, the cheap vacations, the big TVs, the things that have kind of made life relatively tolerable for people over the past few decades. They've only been able to experience those things through access to consumer credit, through access to various kinds of debt. And of course, to come back to your earlier point, one of the things that often isn't really remarked upon is that all of this is dependent upon the rolling out of communications technologies. It's dependent on credit cards. It's dependent on the computerization of the stock markets and the banks in the 1980s. It's really physically dependent on all of those processes. And then eventually you get into a situation like the one we're in now, where really, even things like education are kind of seen as sites of speculative investment. They're seen as things which corporations want to make money from, but they don't even want to make money really from delivering high quality services, which is the headline claim of neoliberalism and advocates for school reform and charter schools and things like this. Really what they want to do is they want to get kind of monopoly control of delivering services in certain areas, and then they want people to invest. They want their investors to give them money on the basis of the assumption that that's going to deliver increased profitability at some time in the future. So financialization to some extent leads to this situation in which the entire economy is driven by speculation on the future and on a kind of permanent set of bets on the permanent inflation of asset prices, share prices, property prices, land prices, and even stuff like Bitcoin. So that is what is involved. I mean, that is what we mean by financialization. Of course, also at the level of kind of political sociology, if you like, it's also about the question of, well, who are the most powerful sections of the capitalist class? I mean, from a Marxian perspective, you can say that going right back to the 19th century, there's often a tension within capitalism, within the capitalist class, between, on the one hand, industrial capital, manufacturers, the people who actually make stuff, and on the other hand, finance capital, the banks, the people who lend them the money to make stuff. And they have convergent interests on a certain time scale and in certain ways, but often within a short to medium term, they have quite different interests. And what's really distinctive about the American economy in the post-war period is that the manufacturing capital, industrial capital, is really in a privileged position. You've got government, you've got unions, you've got a whole kind of regime which is designed to protect their interests. And finance capital has been put in a box. There's all these rules about how much speculation they're allowed to engage in, how much currency speculation, how much lending they're allowed to do, who they're allowed to lend money to. And one of the big objectives of the whole neoliberal project of the 70s, 80s and onwards is to, as David Harvey said years ago, is to restore the power of finance capital, to get those people, to liberate it, to get those people out of the box. And that's a really big part of what happens over that period, I think.
And in many respects, I mean, it seems that during that period, the conflict between the sort of the industrialists and the finance capitalists seems to also break down on some level, in the sense that once we get into an era in this country anywheres where capital is taxed at a much lower rate, capital gains is taxed at a much lower rate than working for a living, the incentive structure for CEOs and board of directors changes dramatically from, I am judged exclusively on the basis of what I produce and how I set up a 5-year plan for this manufacturing outfit and this and that, to all of a sudden like, well, wait a second, I'm actually making my money on the stock price, which is
shareholder value, baby.
Yeah, exactly. And then all of a sudden it becomes like, well, I can juice the stock price by just creating a delta between our revenue and our costs. And I don't have to necessarily raise the revenue. I could lower the cost, and that may cut into the value of this company 5 or 10 years down the road, but my stocks vest 4 years from now. And so I don't care. I mean, that's a little bit, I think, crass and obvious, but that seems to be the dynamic. And suddenly these companies themselves, all the leadership of them, perceive themselves as financialized entities in and of themselves.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
All right.
And the interesting,
Go ahead,
thing is just what happens beyond the just corporations. When you're thinking about financialization, it's not just your corporate executives who are thinking of themselves as financialized entities. It's a lot of ordinary people as well, in a certain sense.
Yeah, you have these guys. These guys are the guys with the most high-paying jobs in the world. They're rolling out their schemes, recruiting people from the Ivy League. So you go through high school and college knowing if you want to join these masters of the universe, you've got to think like that too. You've got to think like one of these short-term, aggressively profit-seeking, speculative finance capitalists. Then it goes further. Politics, because that's where all the money is. So that's where, and they start rolling out policies which start saying even public servants have to think the same way. Even if you're managing a school, for reasons we've already alluded to, you have to think the same way. You end up in a world where like teenagers are watching TikTok videos telling them how they have to be hustlers, and it's all basically the same kind of logic of thinking which proceeds from that. And that's what we mean by hegemony. That's the way in which, these particular powerful forces are able to disseminate a kind of particular way of thinking about the world, a whole kind of pattern of thinking about the world, if you like, what Gramsci calls a common sense. And I think that's a really good example of how a particular kind of common sense gets sort of disseminated. And then you end up in a situation where everybody living in a society like the ones we live in today, even if they hate all that stuff, they kind of know that's the rules of the game. They kind of know that those are the rules you have to play by, even if you hate it.
Yeah, let's talk about this, because I mean, I had this conversation, particularly like in the context of TikTok and Instagram, and I was, saying to, in the context of my children, saying like, basically my kid is learning to commodify herself and getting, a cash substitute in the form of likes, and this has become. And I was talking to someone who was, fairly sympathetic in terms of politics, but the idea of like my saying we should get rid of, we should just simply outlaw most algorithms as far as they work on online, and get rid of these sort of like mechanisms which are basically training people to commodify themselves in some fashion or another, was met with like a just. Wait, what? Like, that's crazy. Even though we had agreed on sort of all the problems, like the idea of getting rid of those things just seemed completely. And that's what, when you write about your theory of passive consent, give us a sense of what that is. And maybe we've just described it.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we've absolutely just described it. So, I mean, I think there's an example that I wrote in the book, which was about Twitter, right? So we're all familiar, I think, especially on the left, with people who, spend all of their time tweeting, posting, largely about how much they hate Twitter, how it's a hell site, how it's ruining public discourse. But they are the ones who are feeding the algorithm, and they're engaging with it. And, pretty much they're doing everything, that Twitter would want them to do. They're generating value for the company through engagement. And, providing you don't resist, you are passively consenting, even if you are critical, ostensibly. And if we're thinking about, how these kinds of platforms are designed, yes, it's about the algorithms, certainly. And we can talk about various platforms, for example, the example which came up in the kind of Facebook whistleblower papers 6 months or so ago, where it was revealed that they were overweighting the angry response emoji something like 4 times compared to all of the other ones, because they, not because they wanted to drive America, crazy with anger, although that might have been one of the effects. It was just people engage more when they're angry. But even beyond that, you mentioned the kind of on TikTok, the kind of version of cash being, likes and all of the kind of metrics involved in it. The very fact that our digital social environment is completely, filled with metrics, everything has a number on it. You are kind of inculcated, you're kind of led to make the number go up, make the number increase in value. And on that kind of basic design level, they are designing for you to kind of passively consent to behave in a certain way. And that way is absolutely, in keeping with neoliberalism. And we describe it as sort of competitive, possessive individualism. You could have social networks and social media sites set up to kind of foster creativity and collaboration and, kind of nuanced thinking. But instead, it's all about heightened emotion, extremely pithy, and, very much focused on how do I maximize my return? How do I make my numbers go up?
Yeah. And so and that has become pervasive. And the way that we got there was I mean, just because early at one stage in the development of the internet, it was, and I guess it combines, this is where it also combines in terms of finance. It's like, we're not making any money off of what we've created, which every major, I think like every major tech platform, at the very least in their first, like whatever percentage of their existence, made no money, but it was all based upon these measures of engagement. Even when there wasn't a clear, like, how are you going to make money off of this? It doesn't matter. We have X million of users. They spend this much time on the platform. So all of the incentive structure is like self-reinforcing, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's absolutely right. I mean, if you think about Google, so Google is largely thought of as being, the company and the application which developed ad technology, right? This is the major paradigm by which you build a useful product and you have no way of monetizing it. Well, if you have attention, then you can sell adverts and then effectively, you're running a search engine, but really you're the world's largest advertising firm. That's really what you do. And, if you look at the kind of the ways in which, big tech is financed, so the kind of the combination of these two elements, you're looking at venture capital. The whole thing is based on, achieving a certain scale beyond which, you are effectively, you're just a monopoly within that given space. So, you're the monopoly in sort of generic social media, your Facebook, you're the monopoly in search or you're the monopoly in image-based
video hosting.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of, they're entirely set up to do that. This is what the finance, and most of them won't turn a profit until they reach that point of monopoly domination. So, it is baked in from the very start, and the social results of that are all around us.
Well, it's baked in from the start. From the moment they need to engage in capital accumulation. Yeah, they need to do proper accumulation of massive profits, which they can then speculate on and invest in. They can use to speculate in the stock market, etc. I mean, it's not historically inevitable that those technologies or even these big monopoly platforms will be used this way. I mean, they could have been, they could have been run by government. They could have been run as huge workers' co-ops. They would be very easy, technically, be incredibly easy to turn YouTube or Spotify or Google into something that is actually just owned by all of its users and doesn't have any motivation to accumulate vast profits and only, it might sell advertising, but they wouldn't have to have these insidious algorithms because they wouldn't need these huge bottom lines. So I think it has to be understood as, partly, it has to be understood that that's not inevitable. It's not inevitable to the tech that it becomes that way, but under the historic conditions of a certain kind of capitalist hegemony, then that's where they end up going. That's where they end up pushing.
Give us, well, I mean, and I think I think people can grasp the sort of the, financial interests of all these people involved, right? I mean, everybody's just trying to score big, and the government's not stepping in and putting any roadblocks to it. Almost like the opposite. We didn't have sales tax online for years. I mean, it was all these things ostensibly to sort of like to grow a nascent industry or sector without any concern as to like what's the shape of it going to look like when it grows, because moneyed interests are going to get in there and they're going to create it in a certain fashion if there's no parameters whatsoever. But what are give us a sense of like the analysis of the material political interests that you look at in the course of this as well?
Well, I mean, our argument and our account is that there's a convergence between the various sets of interests. So there's the finance capitalists, the kind of leading edge of which are the venture capitalists that we talked about, the growing tech industry, also certain political institutions. One of the things we're interested in is the fact that at the same time as all this is emerging over the sort of 80s and 90s, you get the emergence of this professional political class, the people who in the States, the people who are most obviously represented by the Democratic Leadership Council, the people who are going to end up running the Democratic Party, the people who are going to end up producing the kind of Clinton policy agenda. And so all of these sets of interests, we would say, sort of they converge around the project of what we call kind of actually existing neoliberalism. We make that distinction because, a lot of the scholarship on neoliberalism, as Alex said earlier, I think, is primarily interested in the idea that there's this lineage of ideas that starts with think tanks in the 1930s, and it gets picked up by these networks of kind of influencers and academics, and then somehow it gets picked up by people like Reagan, and it becomes part of the kind of governing ideology. And our argument is that is all kind of true, but really, I mean, if you compare what people like Hayek are actually calling for, and you can compare it to what actually happens, even under Reagan, then under Clinton, then under Bush and Obama, then what actually happens isn't really dependent on what Hayek thought should happen or Milton Friedman thought should happen. But what actually happens is what is good for this particular cluster of interests, this particular set of material interests. You got these finance capitalists who've been waiting for decades for some way of liberating themselves from regulation, suppressing organized labor, suppressing wages. You've got the tech people. Well, I think we have to recognize are kind of distinctive, and they they are different, like a Zuckerberg is different from like a finance capitalist because he does actually do something and he writes some code, he produces it. They are kind of different. They are distinctive, and they have their roots in MIT and Stanford, and they have their own kind of history. And this kind of professional political class emerges mainly because the most of the policy agendas that these guys want to promote are ones that don't really have a very broad popular support. Most people, you look at opinion polls, you look at attitude surveys, most people, even in the United States, most people, if you say to them, do you think it's a good idea to tax the rich less than the poor, to suppress labor unions, to really suppress political democracy, like in the interests of corporate profitability, most people are going to say no. We don't think that's a good idea. So you need this kind of class of professionals, people working in media, people working in advertising, people working in political parties. You need this kind of class of professionals whose job it is basically to sell us on the program and or to make us, to persuade us to passively at least go along with it. But then to some extent, everybody, at least large majorities of people, do have to be offered something. We have to be offered some kind of stake in it. It's in the nature of hegemony that the interests of even a majority of people have to be to some extent realized. So what do we get offered? Well, as we said before, what we get offered in return for all this stuff is a fantastic level of private luxury, basically a historically unprecedented set of opportunities to consume. We get the cheap vacations, we get the gadgets, we get lots of flavors of coffee, we get to experience, at least in our lives as consumers and as private individuals in our private lives, we get a level of freedom, we get a level of private luxury for most of us, which is really historically unprecedented. But of course, the cost of all that is we see democracy getting weaker and weaker. We see democratic institutions, collective institutions, all kinds of public institutions getting weaker and weaker and weaker, to the point where really after 2008, we would say, things really start to shift. It becomes much, much harder for that political class to keep people on side. fewer and fewer people can be offered the cheap credit, the cheap mortgages, the decent jobs. Young people are visibly living more precarious lives, poorer people, people of color, urban working classes, people in the deindustrialized regions. The list of people who are not having their interests realized by any of this gets longer and longer and longer, to the point where this all kind of breaks down around kind of 2015, 2016. You get the completely, 12 months earlier, completely unexpected Trump becoming president, Bernie becoming a serious contender, Brexit happening in the UK, the UK almost breaking up because the Scots can't take it anymore. So I guess that's our answer to the question. I mean, that's the way that's the way in which we see sort of material interests playing out.
Are we still sort of captured in that paradigm? I mean, I think when I was a kid and when I was younger, they're just the definitions of these interests were, I mean, it was still pretty nascent, in the early 90s and even during, in Reagan years and even in the late 90s. I mean, there was a real sense of like, we've made the deal. The deal is, like you say, we have an unprecedented level of personal luxury. I mean, the sense in the mid 90s, I just remember looking around going like, I'm falling behind here because everybody seems to be like, new TVs and like all this other stuff. And at one point people start to realize like, oh, we're just on a conveyor belt and we're getting, fed more, like little, energy cubes or whatever it is, but it's getting a little bit tiring to be running this fast on this belt. And on top of the fact that like you say, a significant portion of people left behind because there's only so many of these things that you can get at one point. And so as this starts to break down, let's shift. I mean, that's where we've looked at like the material and the political, I guess, interest here in terms of pushing this, because we have the folks with real money are just pulling away into a completely different universe. But there's also sort of like another like subset of people who they watch those people, go off into the universe and they say like, I want to go there, but they're also slowly moving away from, 90% of the population on some level. Let's talk about like the platforms and infrastructures on the tech side that exacerbate this. I mean, we've touched on it a little bit, but how do they come in and reinforce this or perpetuate it or juice it in some fashion?
Well, what's interesting, if we think we're in a period of breakdown, right? Since about 2016, you can kind of see to some extent the existing political class associated with neoliberalism, the kind of people who, in terms of the sort of Democrats, the kind of people who worship the West Wing, they're having less say, their ideas are less convincing, they're having to give a bit more time to people outside that tradition, maybe a little bit more to the left. So that's kind of collapsing. But what isn't collapsing? Well, what isn't collapsing is finance and big tech. And big tech especially, although it's now facing increasing amounts of, calls for regulation from both left and right for different reasons. And, is facing, in some cases, like, for example, Facebook, terrible headlines. But they are still very much in position for now. And, they are the communication and kind of digital social infrastructure of basically the entire planet, maybe apart from, Russia and China. So, really, they are the continuity element of neoliberalism. You could have a situation where, we, in the best of all possible worlds, elect socialist governments. And, until they heavily regulated these platforms, or really, we would argue, probably go further than that and, reform them in a more radical way, take them public, make them owned by their users, perhaps, or their workers. The basic way in which we interact in everyday life is is literally neoliberal. You know, it's even if you don't like it, if you have to engage with social media, you're engaging with, gaming the numbers. You're engaged with trying to find those emotive hooks that are going to, catch fire and go viral, and all of those other things. And this is continuity neoliberalism in the kind of infrastructure of everyday life. And even though the politics is starting to shift at this level of the kind of technological infrastructure, it really hasn't.
Yeah, I think in terms of this question of like, where are we now? Like, and how continuous or discontinuous is all this stuff? It is really complicated. And we try to get into some detail in the book because we think there isn't just a simple answer. So one of the big debates amongst economists at the moment, at least left economists, is neoliberalism over? I mean, the era of privatization, low taxes, is it over? After the bailouts post 2008, after the furloughing and all the public spending, the government spending through the pandemic, is it now over? And our argument is, well, if we understand neoliberalism as a complex formation that includes that stuff, but it also includes, say, very individualistic competitive culture being normalized in TV, in popular music, on the social media platforms. It also includes, it also involves a situation in which you can't have a figure from the left becoming a serious contender in mainstream politics, etc. The answer to the question, is neoliberalism over, is like kinda. Yeah, right. Kind of. It's breaking down. Like it's changing. We're not living through as big a shift as the 70s. So if we think about that changing dynamic relationship between industrial capital and finance capital, we're not living through a moment quite like that, but there has been a kind of shift. So I would say since 2008, Silicon Valley has really emerged as the dominant fraction of capital. It's really taken on a new role. It's not like it was in the 90s when there was this kind of alliance between venture capital and the banks and the digital economy, and the digital guys were kind of the new scrappy cutting edge disruptors. We're now in a situation in which clearly the dominant figures in global capitalism, at least outside China, are Amazon, Google, Facebook, it's Silicon Valley. And they operate in quite a different way. As Alex said, they don't operate on the basis of competition, of like setting up companies, then shutting them down, then asset stripping them. They do operate in quite a different way on the basis of building these huge monopoly infrastructures that people use. And it's quite early days to say where all that is going. And you can kind of even, I think you can see, like, even in the wider culture, for some people, for some social groups, we're very much still in that kind of cultural historical moment of what we call the long 90s, this sense that really that world is never going to end. My great example of this phenomenon that we call the long 90s a couple of years ago was when Friends was the most popular show on Netflix, and I kept saying to people, can you imagine when Friends was first being broadcast in like the mid 90s, imagine the idea that it was going to be the most popular show on TV, like almost 30 years later, would have seemed extraordinary. So for some people, there's this continuity, and clearly for example, the people running, the DNC, say, and the people who are now in control of the Labour Party in Britain, there's a very deep commitment to the idea that nothing can or must ever change. You can never do anything different. But for other people, as we said, for many constituencies, it's very clear, for many of us, and especially for many young people, for all those people who've been left behind and excluded, that period clearly is over. We're in a different period. Something else has to happen. It's not entirely clear what. It's not entirely clear what else is going to emerge. Like we tried with Bernie, we've tried with Corbyn, we've had Trump. I mean, and it's very early to say like what's happening with Biden's reforms. I mean, maybe that does mark. I mean, maybe the Biden reforms do mark the end of something and the beginning of something new. It's clearly too early to say yet, but maybe they do.
It's interesting that 90s. I mean, personally, like the existence of Friends, I was never particularly a fan of the show, but in terms of my but in terms of my own professional career, I don't know that I would be sitting here if Friends had not exploded the year that I went out to LA, like, because I was, people were very excited about David Schwimmer, and I was I was in a pool of people who, New York sort of Jewy, that type of thing, and then it was like I had, like a printing press for money at that point. But the other point being that in terms of the Democratic leadership, all of them really became national figures, the ones that we have today, during that era. And so their tight grip on this is as much as my refusal to listen to music that I didn't, hear at, I still think that Uncle Tupelo is like these new bands that came out of Uncle Tupelo. I like them, but I still have that mentality, even though I like Uncle Tupelo existed for 4 years in the 90s, I think, and Wilco and Sunvolt have been 20 years each. But that mentality, I think that, happens with these political leadership. And so, all right, well, so with that said, in terms of where we are, where these we're almost like at a riptide, where these two different currents are sort of and we just don't know what's going to come out of that riptide. Where do you guys see the weaknesses in terms of where the power lies, as to for opportunities for those people who are looking to the future rather than trying to maintain this paradigm that existed in the past?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question, isn't it? And I think you've seen in the UK and in the States over the last kind of 5 years, the left, and particularly elements of the left that came up through social movements, so things like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, various green movements, embrace the strategy of essentially, as much as possible, going in with the leading political party of the left, trying to influence a kind of entryist strategy. And we've seen the results of that. And the results of that are they're not simple. So in the States, you've seen, the Bernie agenda, it hasn't won out completely, but it has had influence.
It's done okay.
It's done okay. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Better than anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, Bernie in particular, we're seeing the impact in terms of labor in this country.
Yeah.
There is, we're not where we want to necessarily be, but you can't look at the labor numbers in terms of what's happening on the ground. And also to the extent that the administration has sort of greased the wheels for labor, that's all that is Bernie influencing Biden. And we can see that there at the very least.
I mean, you can see that in the UK as well. I mean, in the UK, the situation's slightly different because, it was as if, our Bernie took control of our Democrats. But, the end result of that with Corbyn and the Labour Party was kind of political disillusion. He never really had full control of the members of parliament who all hated him.
Well, also, he was just never popular. I mean,
he was very briefly popular, but he was never as popular as Sanders was. So we're in a period of where the left has become really, disillusioned and they did the social movement thing in the early 2010s. Then they did the, party politics, electoral politics, and neither of them really worked to the extent that they wanted. But we're also seeing this huge wave of Labour militancy here in a way that has not been the case for, 30, 40 years.
It's not on the same scale as the States, and it's newer. But we're seeing militant trade union leaders becoming popular public figures for the first time, the first time since the
They're
70s.
becoming social media celebrities.
We've watched some of that, actually.
Because they just don't bullshit. There's no bullshit.
Right.
Well, also, I would say this is partly the answer to the question, where are the opportunities, and also where are the fault lines, where are the weaknesses? I mean, we should say something about climate, because that's where the big kind of the fault lines, even within the capitalist class, I think fall along those lines to some extent. That, to be honest, a lot of the people, even in Silicon Valley, have no interest in seeing the planet burn, and fossil fuel capital is becoming increasingly politically isolated, and it's increasingly entrenched on the right. And I think ultimately there is scope for something like a Green New Deal, I think, out of that situation. But coming back to what we were just talking about, I would say, and I've heard you say similar stuff on the show, Sam, so I know you're kind of sympathetic to this view. Like, for anybody like our age who has lived through the kind of ups and downs, the fortunes of the left, really since the early 90s, as you say, for all of the defeats and disappointments and failures, look, the Bernie strategy has worked better than anything else that anyone has tried for the past few decades. Like, we got more out of it, and Corbyn as well. I mean, Corbyn, okay, we're in a bad situation now, but there is at least an organized political left to be defeated in the UK now, which pre-2015 there wasn't. Like, it didn't exist. Like, there just wasn't a left since the late 80s, as I would say pretty much on a national level. There wasn't in the States either after the defeats of the Jesse Jackson campaigns.
And the interests that these figures represent, they're not going away. I mean, those interests are particularly with, stagflation, energy crisis. These interests are really just becoming more and more broad. So
to some extent, the answer is more of that. You've got to keep building on that. I think, we have to keep building on that, and we have to keep building out those coalitions, and we have to keep doing the bits, I would say, the Bernie strategy that have been shown to work, and this is kind of consistent with our theoretical approach in the book, are where your political project is based on reaching out to as many social constituencies as possible and not scolding them for their cultural views, not making a debate over values and identity, but explaining to them why it is in their interest, like what is in it for them about coming on board with your project. Not that it'll make them nice people, but how it will make their lives easier and better, and how it will actually fulfill them on a kind of material level. And the Bernie project has absolutely been most successful, sort of locally and nationally, where people have managed to make that case, where coalitions of a range of political organizations, a range of actors, a range of constituencies, people from NGOs, people from unions, people doing community organizing, have successfully built diverse coalitions that are brought together by a sense of their shared interests. And I think it sounds really obvious. Like, every time I say this, I think, well, like, why am I even saying this? This is ridiculous. What else would you do? But of course, as I said to someone this morning, every time I go and do a meeting, every time I do a talk about this stuff, every time I talk to people, and this is true, if I talk to people in the States as well as here in the UK, at least a third of the people in the room, it's like it's a new idea to them. It's a new idea that, you don't have to choose between doing stuff in the Democratic Party, doing stuff in DSA, doing stuff in trade unions, doing direct action, doing community organizing, doing alternative media. You don't have to choose between those things, because you need to do all of them. Right. That's the only way we're going to win everything. And also, you don't have to worry about the fact all of the time that about the issues that the liberals want us to worry about all the time, issues around identity and values. Sometimes that stuff is important. Sometimes you can't get over it. But for the most part, the task of radical politics is to identify the ways in which large groups of people have common interests and to push that. That's what Bernie did so successfully. It's what, frankly, Jeremy, for all his great features, Jeremy Corbyn wasn't really able to do in the UK. And that is what we have to keep pushing, keep doing more of, I think. And I think there is, in terms of the opportunities, the political opportunities, I think we're seeing it happen now. We know it's happening, but really, I mean, this was the obstacle that Bernie came up against, the obstacle that Corbyn came up against, the first one, not the biggest one, not the most important one, but the one that really stood in the way. At the end of the day, it was the loyalty of those relatively affluent, professional class liberals to that 90s leadership of the Democratic Party. And it was, in my opinion, it was a kind of naivety, really, about the idea that ultimately those professional politicians know what they're doing and have your interests at heart and are willing to kind of are going to try to do the right thing, like it's an episode of The West Wing or something. I think it's really, for me, that's one of those are the constituencies we have to keep winning over. The people who actually turn out for Democratic primaries, they're the people we have to keep trying to win over, as well as all the others. And the thing that will win them over, in my opinion, most likely, if we push on it, is climate change. Sooner or later, it's going to be apparent to all these people, as it's becoming here, that people who are in the pocket of finance capital people who are in the pockets of the banks and Wall Street are never going to do anything about climate change. And I think that realization is one that we can keep pushing and that can really be useful to us, I think.
And I mean, to be clear, the Green New Deal, for instance, really has a lot of provisions that will impact labor and just our whole perspective on what it means to have a job and sort of like expectations of what the government will do for us. I mean, it's not a Trojan horse in the sense that, like, the outside part of it is also really important too. But to fundamentally address climate change, we're going to have to fundamentally reorient the way that we relate to government and whatnot. I want to ask you about the platform reformation that you were talking about, and those ideas, because this is something I feel like that has bedeviled us, quite a bit here, is like how you deal with this. There is sort of this siren song out there of people who are talking about authoritarianism, but without any sort of structural solution. It's really just like, this company evil, this billionaire evil, that one actually pretty good, and less censorious, as if there is no, as if it's not just a question of where they're situated, within this sort of like, game that's going on. But from a structural standpoint, like how do we address these questions, of the monopoly that that Google's trying to create, the monopoly that Amazon's trying to create, the monopoly that Facebook is trying to create, and their implications as to like their privately funded town squares, essentially.
Yeah.
And, so how do we address that without having, a government board that says like, oh no, this crosses the line, we need to have this comment removed? Or what is the mechanism for this?
Yeah, it's a really big question. I mean, the answer that, the mainstream Democrats have settled on is essentially, it's regulation, it's antitrust, it's all the stuff coming out of the FTC under Lena Khan, who, has her sights set on, who's a very, very smart person indeed, who has her sights set on, breaking up some of these big, digital monopolies. And certainly, that wouldn't be bad. I think that would be maybe a step in the right direction. And certainly if you look at, I don't know, a company like Facebook that has essentially just eaten up its competition, in Instagram and WhatsApp, like they should not own those applications. I mean, that's not helping anybody really. That's not delivering value to anybody apart from their shareholders. The thing is, though, is that if you look at the digital space, monopolies appear to be, they're partly a function of the fact that these are capitalist enterprises, but it's also the function of the fact that it's useful to just have one search engine. It's useful to just have, a place where you can buy anything you want. And digital technology makes those useful functions possible. So the question is, we could go down the line of breaking them up, and maybe in the short run, that's a good idea. But in the long run, the problem with these entities is not as kind of, certain critics, particularly liberal critics like Shoshana Zuboff, most famously, her issue is, the issue is that they're surveillance capitalism, but her issue is with the surveillance bit rather than the capitalism bit. And the thing that makes the surveillance so pernicious, this acquisition of data, is the fact that it's driven by these capitalistic imperatives. It's driven, and that perverts the public square. It turns it into something that's being manipulated for profit. How do we actually get away from that? I mean, I think it's surprisingly difficult, because the other option, as you mentioned, which would be to have the state step in and run these things, while socialists might like the state in many ways, I think we should be wary of that. We don't want the state, directly regulating speech like that, and it would be hard to get public consent for that, I think. So, I mean, I think the options that we have seem very far off, but I think it would be something like, having them run by by the workers who work for them, or by the users who are using.
Yeah, they could be user owned. I mean, the technology lends itself to that. There's a lot of work being done by economists and kind of radical policy people on what they call platform cooperatives, and the technology really lends itself to that. I think you could make a really strong political case for, I mean, my favorite example, partly because I teach a lot of music students, is Spotify. Like, everybody hates Spotify. Everybody knows they're an evil company who rip off, musicians left, right, and center, and there's just no need for it. Like, the gap in the amount of money they take per stream, that much of it is to shareholders, that much of it is for running the company, and that much of it is to artists. You just get rid of the bit for shareholders. Even artists selling very few small amounts of music can make a decent income from it. Users would have just as good an experience, a better experience. The world would be a better place. All you have to do is take money from that evil little munchkin who runs it, who's investing all his profits in building AI weapons. So that's his thing. He's going into
and funding Joe Rogan.
Yeah. So that you can make a very good case for it. Of course, politically, it would be very challenging. And let's be realistic, that is not happening except in a situation where you have an American administration, which is at least where the current one is, or probably significantly to the left of it, and also a majority of the most powerful countries in the European Union, in that place. But ultimately, that's what you got to aim for. That's what we got to think about over the medium to long term. I would say that's one answer. Also, we do suggest at the end of the book, probably realistically, to be honest, we're probably not going to get to the point where we can turn Google into an international, workers and users own cooperative before we have to really address the climate crisis. Probably in terms of priorities, probably that's something like a few decades down the line. I think we have to have it in our minds as kind of an imaginative horizon. I think it's a really important kind of teaching point to keep making to people, especially young people, that there's just nothing in this tech that means it has to work that way. But probably realistically, Green New Deal is the bigger priority. And probably, I envisage a situation, I don't claim to have any kind of, capacity to predict the future. But, I kind of envisage a situation in which, we're going to have to be putting pressure on the tech guys. We're going to have to be organizing. We need to see big labor organization among workers in tech. We need big pressure from users. We need the threat of antitrust. We need the kind of things that people, like Zuboff talks about, and people at Zephyr, what's her name?
Zephyr Teacher
is pushing for. We need the threat of all that. We need some of that done. In order to kind of limit their power, but probably, we are going to have to also find which of those companies we can kind of work with, which will, tolerate, which of them are going to be willing to endorse something like a Green New Deal, or at least tolerate it, because I just don't see the kind of balance of class forces being such that we're going to, abolish digital capitalism within my lifetime. I might be wrong, but and that's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really difficult. I don't like saying it because, my gut feeling is I just hate all those guys. I obviously I hate them for all the same reasons most people listening to and watching this are going to hate them. But but the oil companies are still there. We've got to fuck them first. Sorry, we got to deal with them first. We've got to deal with them.
I think first. I think it's really important for people to be able to make these assessments and acknowledge the reality of these things, because otherwise you're out there, and I think it's also important too, because it makes people be aware of who is trying to sell you fool's gold that will take you down a path that really has no beginning, middle, or it has a beginning, but it doesn't have a middle or an end. And you just sort of end up in this sort of cul-de-sac. One of the things I like about antitrust, and I think listeners of the show know that I'm sort of, it's one of my bailiwicks, is that I think the only way to get from where you're to where you're talking about, and whatever that looks like there, is to undercut the power of these entities as soon and as quickly and as hard as we can. Because, as Grover Norquist said, he wanted to make government weak enough to strangle it in the bathtub. I want to use government to make these entities, at the very least, where they're afraid of being, drowned in the bathtub, essentially.
Yeah.
And you got to get them small enough so they can fit in it at this point.
I think it's very persuasive.
And I think I see antitrust as a necessary interim step to anything that is good, essentially, that we like. But I think it's really important also that people can understand this dynamic of the way that it works with platforms. It's really fascinating stuff, and I really appreciate you guys coming on to talk about it. The book is Hegemony Now: how big tech and Wall Street won the world, and parentheses, and how we win it back. And
they made us put that.
Yeah,
I was going to say, like, you can't write a book about politics without the publisher saying, like, well, you gotta include like how you change it. There has to be a call to action type of thing. Jeremy Gilbert and Alex Williams, thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm in the podcast and YouTube descriptions. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Sam. Cheers.
Bye-bye. All right, folks, we're going to head into the fun half of the program. I am essentially exhausted worker. UFCW 1059 are getting screwed and could use some attention. Kroger has given us their final offer, and it's a joke after we help make them billions. If anyone out there hears this, vote to strike. If we stand together, we can remind them why we're essential. That is from Essentially Exhausted Worker. We will take more IMs and your phone calls as we enter into the fun half. 646-257-3920 is the number. Ran a little late with those guys, but interesting stuff.
Good conversation.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I really appreciate their work. People should check it out. And just a reminder, if you appreciate our work, you can become a member and help this show survive and thrive. Become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you go to jointhemajorityreport.com, you not only, when you become a member, you not only get the free half free of commercials, you also get the fun half full of often, but not always, fun. Somewhere between sometimes and often, it's fun.
Usually.
Pretty close to usual. I will say that. I just don't want to make any promises I can't deliver on.
The intermittently fun half?
Yes. Certainly, if there's going to be fun, it will happen there. Let's put it there, that way, in the fun half. We take your phone calls, we take your IMs, we, joke around. Anyways, check that out. And don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. They are a completely employee-owned coffee company in Madison, Wisconsin. They really take care of their suppliers all around the world. They started by helping out farmers in the Zapatista region of Mexico and have expanded. And they do not abandon these people when their yields are low or there's having a tough time with weather or whatnot. Just a great all-around company and great coffee. So win-win. And you can get the Majority Report blend. Also, football started. I'm not going to be paying attention to this year because Patriots look like they're garbage. And so it's too painful. I get thrown back to like images of Victor Kayam and the whole Lisa Olson scandal, and I can't, and like still miss Russ Francis. It's too hard for me. But if you're a normal person who loves football, then you have to tune in to the ESVN show. That is the Emma Sports Vigeland Network. You can find it on the Majority Report YouTube channel. You can also find it at youtube.com/ESVN.
ESPN show. Yes, sorry, I got that right.
ESPN
show.
And you can also find it on Spotify or iTunes or wherever your podcasts, you can hear it. And it's live Tuesdays, 4 p.m., right? So tomorrow, 4 p.m., live, breaking down the NFL. I mean, eventually she'll be talking about other sports. I think it continues to do it. We'll see.
When the NBA and the NHL season starts, we'll do a similar thing. So, yeah.
So check that out. Do not miss that. I think we had 20,000 people watch the first show. Oh, wow. Something like that. Sports are apparently very popular in this country. Matt, what's happening in the Matt Leckian media universe?
Well, not media. If you want Matt Leck unmediated, October 23rd, the Terragram Ballroom in Los Angeles with Ben Burgess. So This Is Revolution, folks. David Griscom, Nando Villa, Anna Kasparian, Danny Bessner.
Whoa.
Lots of people. So get your tickets now, folks. Also, for Patreons, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We had a think tank this weekend, and I'll be talking to Aaron Kleinman about elections tomorrow night.
When are you coming back from that? I mean, it's.
I don't know. I haven't. It's kind of open ended.
Oh, all right. Well, that's
maybe never.
Okay, great. Okay,
just gonna be a LA guy.
What's that ZipRecruiter coupon code? Folks, see you in the fun half.
Three months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now. And I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now. But I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow. What? What is that going on? It's nuts. Wait a second. Hold on for a second. Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone?
Nomiki.
You did it. Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false. No, I'm sorry. Women's.
Stop talking for a second. Now let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude, you want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? This me?
Yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello, is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day. What's on your mind?